Hello and welcome to Deep Dive on News6 World. I'm Asuma Katauka. For the last year, global trade has felt less like a system of rules and more like a game of high-stakes poker. In the recently reconfigured Washington power corridors, the new mantra is simple: reciprocity. You want access to the American consumer, you better have a seat at the table ready for American goods. Nowhere is this shift more evident than in Bangladesh. Yesterday, February 9, 2026, Dhaka and Washington sealed a landmark trade pact that marks a historically new level in relations. It's a deal born out of months of grueling negotiations led by interim chief advisor Muhammad Yunus, and it could be the lifeline the country's vital garment industry desperately needs. Here are the concrete numbers first. The headline rate. The US has agreed to reduce Bangladesh's reciprocal tariff rate to 19%. That's a significant drop from the initial 37% proposed in early 2025 and slightly below the 20% interim rate set last August. But the real secret sauce of this deal isn't just the lower tariffs. It's the innovative preferential scheme. Under this new mechanism, Bangladesh will receive tariff-free access to the U.S. market for textiles and apparel equivalent to its imports of U.S.-produced cotton and man-made fibers. The calculation is rigorous. It's measured on a square meter basis. Effectively, if Dhaka buys American cotton, it gets to sell the finished shirt back to the U.S. with zero additional duty. It's a classic fiber for fabric swap that turns a traditional trade deficit into a coordinated supply chain. Of course, reciprocity is a two-way street. In exchange for this access, Bangladesh is opening the floodgates. The Yunus administration has agreed to remove barriers to U.S. industrial and agricultural goods. We're talking about everything from chemicals and medical devices to U.S. beef, poultry, and dairy products. And it does not stop at food. Bangladesh has committed to purchasing 25 aircrafts from American giant Boeing, a deal valued at over $3 billion. Furthermore, Dhaka is signing on for $15 billion in U.S. energy products, including LNG, over the next 15 years. Washington isn't just asking for free trade, it is asking for guaranteed sales. But how does this stack up against the rest of the region? This is where the geopolitics gets spicy. In the race for the American closet, Bangladesh is now running a very tight heat with its neighbors. India recently secured an 18% rate, just 1 point lower than Bangladesh. But India's deal required cutting Russian oil imports and a staggering $500 billion purchase commitment. Vietnam, Bangladesh's biggest rival in apparel. Vietnam is currently sitting at a 20% reciprocal tariff. This new deal officially makes Bangladesh products more competitive than Vietnamese ones in the U.S. ports. Pakistan currently tied with Bangladesh at 19%. The strategic context here is clear. Under President Trump's Reciprocal Trade Act, the U.S. is systematically dismantling old preferential systems like GSP in favor of these bilateral quid pro quo pacts. By moving fast, the Yunus government has ensured that Bangladesh isn't left behind in the tariff bloodbath. However, the deal comes with strings attached. Bangladesh has committed to stricter enforcement of labor rights, a moratorium on WTO electronic transmission duties, and the adoption of U.S. vehicle safety standards. It is a full-scale realignment of Bangladesh's regulatory DNA towards Washington. Bottom line, the U.S.-Bangladesh trade deal is a pragmatic masterclass in survival. By tying its exports to the import of American raw materials, Bangladesh has created a win-win that insulates its garment sector from protectionist winds. The question is whether the domestic economy can absorb the influx of American agricultural and industrial competition. But in a world where tariffs are the new weaponry, Dhaka just secured a very sturdy shield. As Bangladesh heads towards general elections this week, this trade deal may well be the crowning economic achievement of the interim regime. Now for this, we welcome Ms. Mitali Nikore. She's an economist, joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much, Ms. Nikore, for joining us. Good to see you. Now looking at Bangladesh and US, the deal allows zero tariff access for garments made with US cotton on a square meter basis. Does this reciprocal volume requirement risk turning Bangladesh into a captive market for US raw materials, potentially preventing manufacturers from sourcing cheaper or higher quality textiles from elsewhere?
So, what is the hardest part, I think, when it comes to manufacturing any commodity and particularly textiles is that, you need to have clarity on a production process, and that production process has to be uniform across your factory. So, say if even if I'm an MSME, I can't have, one part of my factory which is manufacturing textile-based goods using US cotton, and then another part of my factory which is using cotton which is domestic, say produced within Bangladesh itself. And I cannot have another part which is producing, using cotton that's been imported from elsewhere for a different market. It's just not possible. That is not how any economy or any particular factory would achieve economies of scale. So I do feel that this particular measure and this particular, clause that Bangladesh has agreed to in its deal is quite problematic, and often and very honestly, it reminds me of the colonial times. It reminds me of a time when India was a much bigger country, and there was this traditional imposition by the British colonies on Bengal, the United Bengal at that time, to use English cotton. And that was how the deindustrialization of Bengal began. So, to be very honest, I find this particular clause to be extremely problematic, and I feel like by agreeing to it, Bangladesh has really tied itself into a few knots.
Thank you for highlighting that, Ms. Nikore. Now, staying on this, Bangladesh has agreed to also open its doors to US beef, poultry, and dairy. Given that these sectors are highly subsidized in the US, can Bangladesh's domestic farming sector survive this influx, or are we looking at permanent displacement of local producers?
So on that, I have a slightly different take. I think that for, the way the Bangladesh economy is structured, I do think that the imports from the US will be priced very differently from the local, local food products. And it's not that a lot of cities in Bangladesh would be able to absorb, the imports from the US. It would mainly be concentrated in cities, particularly cities like Dhaka, Sylhet, some of the larger cities, possibly even in the, Tamabil area. And it is even possible that there may be some, premiumization that is associated with these imports. But the market will remain limited, and I do think that the local manufacturers will then be limited to, some of the smaller areas, the smaller cities, and rural areas. But I don't see the sector getting wiped out in any way. And also, Bangladesh does export quite a lot of its meat outside of Bangladesh as well, and I do think that that will continue in its current form. So I do think it'll open the market for premium products.
Thank you for highlighting that, Ms. Nikore. And now, by adopting US FDA certifications and vehicle safety standards, Bangladesh is effectively aligning its regulatory DNA with Washington. Does this streamline trade at the cost of making significantly harder for Bangladesh to trade with other major partners like the EU or China, which has different standards?
So I think again it's a bit different for EU and a bit different for China. I think the US FDA standards harmonize well with the EU standards. The EU standards are actually even tougher than the US FDA standards, particularly when it comes to green manufacturing requirements and environmental regulations. So the EU standards, in any case, were something that were not really being met even before from Bangladesh. I think the biggest problem is going to be alignment with Chinese standards, because China's standards are very different from US FDA. They allow for a lot more materials in manufacturing. They allow for also for the electric vehicles, they allow for very different levels of procurement processes, manufacturing processes, and they don't have a lot of very stringent ESG regulations. They don't have a very stringent manufacturing process regulation. So, if Bangladesh sets its automotive standards to meet US FDA requirements, it essentially creates a scenario where a lot of Chinese vehicles may not, and Chinese companies may not actually qualify under the US FDA standards, and then Bangladesh as a market closes for them. On the other hand, US manufactured cars and vehicles can easily come in. And of course, this is not only about passenger cars, but about, logistics vehicles and two-wheelers, which are, being imported in large numbers in Bangladesh.
And with Bangladesh now at a 19% rate plus the unique fiber for fabric incentive, how does this disrupt the competitive balance against India at 18%, Pakistan at 19%, and Vietnam at 20%? And is Washington effectively using these tiered tariff rates to force a loyalty race among South and Southeast Asian nations to see who can offer the best purchase commitments for American goods?
There is no doubt that Washington is forcing the countries in South and Southeast Asia, all of which are known for textile manufacturing, all of which are known for engineering goods, machinery goods manufacturing. See, I would say that amongst all these countries, very honestly, India seems to have secured the best deal, because India has also offered purchase commitments, and none of these other countries have been able to offer purchase commitments because of the fact that their economies are not as large as the Indian economy, and their per capita incomes are much lower than the Indian per capita income, and also India's growth and purchasing power is far ahead. So it's very difficult to compare, and also quite unfair to compare India with Bangladesh and with Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam still we can have a comparison, but with Bangladesh, it's absolutely impossible to compare India. And it's quite surprising that a country like Bangladesh should go ahead and trade away so much of its autonomy when it comes to the auto sector or the textile sector, just to secure a 1 or 2% reduction in the tariffs, because it's still a tariff that's 1 percentage higher than India. And overall, we've seen a lot of textile factories in Bangladesh shut down over the last year simply because of law and order issues as well. So it's not only about, just competitiveness on the cost, but also on the working conditions and the operating conditions for a number of global textile units, which have actually moved operations to South India and West India. So, very honestly, definitely these moves by Washington are not in line with the rules-based trading order. Definitely, these moves by Washington are meant to arm twist developing countries and the global South, and that is, leading us into a very dangerous era of globalization. But at the same time, the deal that Bangladesh has secured seems to have a number of, words of caution for the country's economic future.
With that, I'd like to thank Ms. Nikore for sharing that deep insight with us on NewsX World.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a wrap on this edition of Deep Dive. Stay tuned to NewsX World for more news and updates.